30 myths are waiting for you. 30 times you'll feel that special jolt, a mix of amazement, a touch of embarrassment, and pure delight. Amazement at how far from the truth we were. Embarrassment at how long we believed it. Delight that the truth is far more intriguing. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind these myths that have persisted for centuries, please support this series with a like and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. Your feedback will inspire us to explore new archives. So let's open the first door. Step inside. Myth number 1. The naked genius in the bathtub, or how beautiful legends are born. Picture this scene. It's vivid and undeniable. Syracuse, around BC. An old man with a wild gray beard sinks into a full bathtub. Water spills over the edge. Suddenly, epiphany. He jumps up, wet and naked, consumed by the ecstasy of discovery, racing through the streets, shouting one word, "Eureka! I found it!" Neighbors recoil in shock. Children laugh. And the great Archimedes notices nothing. He has grasped one of the fundamental laws of physics. This image is deeply embedded in humanity's cultural memory. It's featured in textbooks, documentaries, and recounted in physics classes around the globe. Archimedes in the bathtub is the quintessence of genius, a symbol of sudden enlightenment, a beacon of science. For centuries, this story has served as proof that great discoveries don't come in the silence of a lab, but through serendipitous moments. But here's a question few ever ask. Who actually witnessed this? The tale of Archimedes, the bathtub, and the shout of Eureka comes from a single source, a treatise by the Roman architect Vitruvius, written about 200 years after Archimedes died. 200 years of oral transmission, retellings, inevitable embellishments, and simplifications. Vitruvius himself wasn't a mathematician or a scientist. He mentioned this story in passing in a work on architecture to illustrate a problem supposedly posed to Archimedes by King Hiero II, to determine if a jeweler had mixed silver into a pure golden crown. This problem, it's worth noting, was entirely real and genuinely challenging. The crown weighed exactly as it should, but the king's suspicions lingered. Here's where it gets interesting. The principle of buoyancy, as described by Vitruvius, water displacement, doesn't actually work for solving the crown problem, mathematically speaking. Not at all. Think about it. The volume difference between a golden crown and one mixed with silver, while weighing the same, would be minuscule, talking about fractions of a cubic centimeter. Ancient measuring instruments lack the precision to detect such a slight difference in displaced water. This isn't speculation. It's a basic calculation carried out by modern physicists attempting to replicate the experiment. The method simply doesn't work, at least not in the simplistic form of a bathtub overflowing with water. So how did Archimedes actually solve the problem? Among scholars there are several theories, and one of the most convincing belongs to Galileo. He wrote a brief treatise titled La Bilancetta, or The Little Balance. In it, Galileo suggested that Archimedes used hydrostatic scales, measuring an object first in air and then in water, to determine its specific weight. This method is far more accurate and aligns better with the level of mathematical rigor found in Archimedes' work. There's also a subtle point to consider. Archimedes himself never mentions a bathtub or the exclamation Eureka. His surviving works, on floating bodies, on the measurement of a circle, and the method, are written in a dry, strict mathematical style. He was evidently a man obsessed with proofs and the rigor of reasoning. The very idea that he would run naked down the street, leaving a thought unfinished, contradicts everything we know about his character and method. But why has this story survived, flourished, and become canonical? Because it fulfills a deep human need. We like to think that genius is a flash of insight, a lightning strike, a moment of inspiration. We don't want to believe that genius is the result of years of grueling work, mountains of written notes, and countless discarded hypotheses. The story of the bathtub is simple and democratic. It suggests that anyone might have a breakthrough while relaxing in their bath. A narrative about years of systematic effort is far less inspiring. The word Eureka, however, could very well have belonged to Archimedes, though it didn't need to be shouted while he was running down the street. Moreover, Eureka is the first-person singular perfect tense of the Greek word heurekein, which means to find. It's a perfectly ordinary Greek word that anyone could say the moment they discovered something, whether it was keys, the solution to a problem, or a lost child. The real Archimedes is a far more majestic and complex figure than the merry old man in a bathtub. He was a solitary genius, armed only with a reed pen and papyrus, who developed methods of integral calculus 18 centuries before Newton and Leibniz. He was an engineer whose machines, catapults, cranes, and possibly a system of mirrors for igniting ships, kept Roman legions at bay for almost 3 years during the siege of Syracuse. He was a mathematician who calculated the value of pi with astonishing accuracy, using the method of inscribed and circumscribed polygons, leaving that precision unchallenged for centuries. In 212 BC, when a Roman soldier finally killed him, disobeying a direct order from Marcellus to bring the scholar in alive, Archimedes was, according to legend, engrossed in geometric diagrams drawn in the sand. "Don't disturb my circles," were supposedly his last words, according to various sources. This story, too, is likely apocryphal, but it captures the essence of the man far more accurately than the tale of a bathtub and street shouts. Archimedes deserves to be remembered as he was, not as a fortunate genius whose leaves floated into his bathtub, but as one of the greatest minds to have ever lived on Earth, working systematically, rigorously, and tirelessly. This narrative, however, sells less well. As we bid farewell to the image of a wet genius running down the streets, we are greeted by another myth, that of people often considered filthy and ignorant. The myth of the Middle Ages, born not from the ignorance of those it speaks of, but from the arrogance of those who created it. Myth number 2. The Dirty Middle Ages, or How Enlightenment Slandered the Past. The word medieval has become synonymous with backwardness, savagery, and filth in contemporary language. Phrases like medieval methods, medieval thinking, and medieval sanitation are used to describe something completely unacceptable in the 21st century. This language is rooted in a specific image: dark streets of European cities, littered with waste, dirty, unwashed people in rags who genuinely believed that bathing was a sin because naked bodies exposed them to the devil and that water washed away the sacred oil of baptism. Where did this image originate? From the works of Renaissance and especially Enlightenment thinkers, individuals who defined their identity by contrasting themselves with the Dark Ages. It was advantageous for them to depict the previous era as a pit of ignorance from which they rescued humanity. They did so with great pleasure and literary flair. The result has remained so convincing that it persists in the collective consciousness to this day. The problem is, it's untrue. Let's start with the basics, sources. If we delve into medieval medical treatises, of which there are plenty, we find regular prescriptions for bathing. The famous Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, written in the 11th century and serving as the primary medical textbook in European universities until the 17th, details personal hygiene rules, how often one should bathe, what the water temperature should be, and how bathing affects health. Medieval monastic rules, the Rule of St. Benedict and its numerous derivatives, included specific directives on hand washing before meals and regular bathing. Medieval cities had public baths, not mere puddles, real baths with hot water, scrapers, and staff. In 13th century Paris, records indicate there were over 26 public baths. In London, establishments called stews offered hot baths. In many German cities, baths operated several times a week, and visiting them was a normal part of city life, much like going to a cafe today. Wealthy individuals, of course, had baths in their homes. There are detailed descriptions of bathing practices in castles, including the additives for the water: rose water, aromatic herbs, flower petals. Expensive bathing oils were items of trade, often found listed in the inventories of wealthy households. Body scrubbing gloves, medieval counterparts to modern sponges, were sold in markets. Now, let's discuss theology. Was there a belief in the Middle Ages that bathing was a sin? Some theologians expressed caution about luxurious baths, but their concerns were far from hygiene-related. Baths were social hubs, where men and women sometimes found themselves in dangerously close quarters, where prostitution thrived, and where people relaxed and enjoyed themselves. The Church's criticism of baths focused on immorality rather than cleanliness. The Church Fathers, advocating for a life of asceticism, sometimes renounced bathing as a bodily pleasure, but this was more of an ascetic practice among a minority rather than a norm. So, what caused the actual decline in hygiene during certain periods? It wasn't theology, but epidemics. In the mid-14th century, when the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe, doctors of the time grew concerned that open skin pores after a hot bath made individuals vulnerable to miasmas, toxic vapors that were thought to cause disease. Although this theory was mistaken, it was based on medical rather than religious concerns. Following the epidemics, the frequency of bathing did decrease, lasting from the 14th to the 17th century. This period gave rise to later depictions of unclean Europe. However, this doesn't reflect the entire Middle Ages. It's a specific historical era driven by specific fears. There's another aspect that shatters the caricature of the time. Medieval washing practices were quite developed. Clothes were washed, bleached, and aired out. Underclothes, shirts, underskirts, were regularly washed because they came into contact with the body. Body odor was socially unacceptable in medieval society, just as it is today. Documented evidence reveals that lack of cleanliness drew public disapproval. So, where does this persistent smell of myth come from? Partly, it's due to the confusion between poverty and dirtiness. Poor people in any era tended to be less clean than the wealthy, not from beliefs, but due to lack of resources. A peasant living in a one-room home with livestock wasn't exactly a model of hygiene, but neither was an urban poor person in the slums of 19th century London or 20th century New York. This isn't a feature of the Middle Ages, it's a consequence of poverty. Additionally, it comes from literature. Biographies of ascetic saints who deliberately renounced comfort were interpreted by later readers as describing the norm. Saint Simeon the Stylite went years without bathing. This is a depiction of virtue, not a standard. The real Middle Ages were more complex, contradictory, and cleaner than its reputation suggests. This revelation is important not because we need to rehabilitate the past, but because it reminds us that every era tends to portray the previous one as dark in order to appear brighter in contrast. This isn't historical methodology, it's propaganda. By the way, the next myth also pertains to reputation, not of an era, but of a war. It's about how convenient explanations for defeats rewrite history to serve those who can't handle the truth. Myth number 3. Betrayed soldiers, or who really lost Vietnam. There are narratives that a nation tells itself to cope with defeat, not because they are true, but because they are psychologically necessary. The story of the war that was betrayed on the home front is one such narrative, and it has proved so resilient that it's still echoed from podiums, in movies, and in political speeches. The image is simple and seductive. The American soldier, brave, professional, undefeated on the battlefield. The Viet Cong suffer losses at a rate of 10 to 1 or more. Yet back home, in university lecture halls and on television screens, the anti-war movement undermines morale. Journalists report demoralizing news, and politicians, pressured by the crowd, cut funding and force the army to abandon the fight halfway through. Soldiers who lost no battles went on to lose the war because of betrayal at home. This concept is referred to as the stab in the back, echoing the German myth of the Dolchstoßlegende after World War I, and it is just as historically unfounded. Let's examine the facts, not the images, but the numbers and documents. American forces did indeed win most tactical confrontations, that's true. But the military strategy of North Vietnam was never about winning tactical battles, it was about winning over time. General Von Winziap and his strategists understood that they couldn't destroy the American army in open combat. Their goal was different: to inflict enough casualties so that American society would grow weary of the war and demand its end. This is not a secret. It's a documented strategy that Giap articulated publicly. In other words, the anti-war movement was not the reason for America's defeat. It was a target of the enemy's strategy. This fundamentally changes the evaluation of the situation. American society reacted just as Hanoi had anticipated, not out of weakness or betrayal, but because democracy responds to human losses, while the communist government of North Vietnam could ignore its own casualties at a cost that was unattainable for a democratic state. Now, let's talk about the military failures that are conveniently glossed over in the betrayal at home narrative. The body count strategy, measuring success by the number of enemy killed, created monstrous incentives for falsifying reports. Unit commanders felt compelled to inflate enemy casualties for the sake of their careers. Reports were sent up the chain, embellished further, and the Pentagon received a picture of a victorious war that had nothing to do with reality. This issue has been extensively documented, including internal U.S. Army investigations. The pacification program, an attempt to control the rural population of South Vietnam, failed not because of protests in Berkeley, but due to fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of war. American strategists brought models from World War II and Korea, wars between states with clear front lines, and discovered a completely different conflict, where the front was everywhere and nowhere, and the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian. The Tet Offensive of 1968 became a turning point not because the American army was defeated. Militarily, the Viet Cong's offensive was repelled, with heavy losses for the attackers. However, it shattered the main narrative that the Johnson administration sold to Americans, that the war was nearing a victorious conclusion and that there was light at the end of the tunnel. If the enemy could simultaneously attack over 100 locations across South Vietnam, then the narrative was a lie. And Americans understood this, not because journalists betrayed them, but because the facts became undeniable. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which the Nixon administration presented as an honorable peace, were essentially a capitulation with a delay. The conditions to which the U.S. agreed were categorically unacceptable in 1969, but became acceptable in 1973. North Vietnamese troops remained in the south of the country. This was not a victory. It was a managed withdrawal. The anti-war movement certainly influenced politics, but it was a symptom rather than a cause. The real issue was that the war was going poorly, and American families receiving death notices had the right to know. The legend of betrayal from within is convenient because it shifts responsibility from military and political leaders to the people who are simply reacting to the loss of their children. This is a morally inverted story, which is why it's so appealing to those who made the decisions. However, myths about the right cause emerged long before Vietnam. The next myth regarding the most celebrated military campaign of Christianity will show us how a noble legend conceals a far more mundane reality. Myth number 4, God wills it, or what really drove the Crusaders. Deus vult, God wills it. This cry swept over the crowd in Claremont in November 1995, when Pope Urban II delivered a speech that changed history. Thousands of people, according to chronicles, immediately began sewing red cloth crosses onto their shoulders, symbols of pilgrimage and military vows. Thus began what we refer to as the First Crusade. The official narrative, repeated by historians, theologians, and popularizers for 9 centuries, is as follows. Western Christians, shocked by reports that Muslim Seljuk conquerors were desecrating holy sites and oppressing pilgrims, rose up in a holy war to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. It was a movement of faith, selfless, sacrificial, driven by genuine religious fervor. That's partly true. And that's why it's so difficult to unravel. Let's start with what preceded the speech in Claremont. Just months before, Urban II received a letter from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The letter contained a request for military assistance against the Seljuks, who had reclaimed most of Asia Minor from Byzantium over the previous decades. This was not a religious call, it was a political request from an ally in distress. Urban II was a shrewd politician. He understood that he had the opportunity to address several pressing issues with one move. First, the knightly class of Western Europe had long posed a serious threat to the social order. Landless younger sons of noble families, lacking peaceful occupations, resorted to robbery, banditry, and endless private wars which troubled the civilian population and the church itself. Redirecting their aggression outward, towards a war against the infidels would be a brilliant solution. Secondly, the crusade offered a chance to significantly enhance the authority of the papacy, which was then locked in a sharp conflict with the German emperors. Leading a war on behalf of all Christianity would automatically elevate the Pope above any secular ruler. Now, regarding the persecution of Christians in Jerusalem, the Seljuks captured the city in 1071, 24 years before Clermont. In those 24 years, pilgrimages to Jerusalem continued unabated. Christian pilgrims kept coming to the Holy City, paying tolls and praying at the Holy Sepulchre. There was no systematic persecution of Christians. This is documented by sources, including the Crusaders themselves, who upon their arrival in Jerusalem found thriving Christian communities. Urban speech at Clermont has survived in several versions, all written after the campaign was successful. Chroniclers, describing it, put words into the Pope's mouth that already knew of victory. We don't know exactly what he said in November 1095. The makeup of the participants in the campaign is also noteworthy. Alongside the sincerely devout knights who took a vow of poverty for the duration of the crusade, stood individuals with very specific earthly interests. Norman adventurers from southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, viewed the campaign as an opportunity to establish their own states in the east. And that's exactly what happened. Bohemond became the Prince of Antioch, not relinquishing it to Alexios, to whom it rightfully belonged. Raymond of Toulouse sought to become the King of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon, before setting out on the campaign, sold or mortgaged nearly all his lands, indicating not selflessness, but a man betting on future conquests. Finally, let's discuss what transpired during the capture of Jerusalem in the 1099. Chronicles, including those written by Crusaders, recount the indiscriminate massacre of a city's inhabitants, regardless of their faith. Not only Muslims were killed, but also Jews, who were herded into synagogues and burned, as well as Eastern Christians, whom the Crusaders could not distinguish from their enemies. These chronicles describe warriors standing in blood up to their ankles, praising the Lord. They were deeply convinced of the righteousness of their cause, and this conviction makes their actions particularly striking. The First Crusade was a religious movement, a political project, and a conquering adventure all at once. To explain it through only one of these lenses is to mislead. The truth is, people rarely act for a single reason, and histories that simplify the complex almost always obscure some aspect of the reality. From holy wars to a cup of tea. Our next myth also concerns origins, but in a much more peaceful and elegantly constructed manner. Myth number 5. The Divine Drink, or How a Legend of Discovery is Made. 3,000 years before our era, the wise Chinese emperor Shen Nong sits in his garden beneath a tree while a servant boils water for him. For even then, it was known in China that raw water could be dangerous. A gentle breeze sweeps through the garden, dislodging a few leaves from a nearby branch and dropping them straight into the boiling vessel. The water changes color. It becomes a delicate amber. The court scholar, naturally curious due to his position, takes a sip. Aroma, flavor, vitality, clarity of thought. Thus, according to one of the most popular versions, tea was discovered. This story is wonderful. It contains an element of chance, a wise observer, and a majestic setting. It perfectly fits the genre of the discovery myth, the same genre featuring Archimedes in his bath and Newton with his apple. Chance plus a ready mind, and something emerges that changes the world. Yet, the historical value of this tale is nearly zero. To begin with, Shen Nong is a mythical figure. He is not a historical character for whom we have documentary evidence. He is the legendary divine farmer, credited in Chinese tradition with the discovery of agriculture, medicine, various plants, and yes, tea. He serves a similar function to Prometheus or Romulus, a cultural hero to whom society attributes milestones that actually unfolded gradually over millennia through the efforts of millions of nameless people. The legend of Shen Nong and tea first appears in written sources not in ancient times, but relatively late, in Tang Dynasty literature around the 8th century AD. It was roughly at this time that tea began its transformation from a medicinal remedy and regional beverage into a national cultural phenomenon. In other words, the story of its discovery was crafted during the period when a beautiful narrative about the origins of the beloved drink had become desirable. What does the real history tell us? It is far less romantic, but much more intriguing. Tea, as a plant, Camellia sinensis, originates from the mountainous regions at the intersection of present-day Yunnan in China, Myanmar, and India. This is where the plant grew wild for thousands of years. The local people, particularly the ethnic groups of Yunnan, consumed tea leaves long before it became a Chinese tradition, chewing them, brewing them into salty, fat-based soups, and using them for medicinal purposes. The first reliable historical references to tea date back to the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. This is a far cry from the 3,000 years BC mentioned in legends. It's 5,000 years later. Early documents primarily describe tea as medicine. It was consumed for headaches, fatigue, and to aid digestion. It wasn't until much later that it became known as a pleasurable drink. A significant cultural shift occurred during the Tang Dynasty, 6th to 10th centuries AD, transforming tea into a philosophical and aesthetic phenomenon. Around this time, the canonical work, The Tea Classic by Lu Yu emerged, the first specialized treatise on tea in the world, outlining its preparation, varieties, and the aesthetics of tea drinking. This transformation of tea into an art form necessitated a corresponding myth of origin, an ancient and worthy one connected to a legendary sage. Alongside the Chinese narrative, there existed an Indian version of tea's origins, linked to the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma who, according to legend, cut off his eyelids during meditation to avoid falling asleep, and from those fallen eyelids, tea bushes grew. This story is even more obviously mythical, yet it highlights an important connection. Tea and Buddhist meditation went hand in hand, and it was through Buddhist monasteries that the beverage spread to Japan and Korea. The history of tea is a tale of how a practice born at the crossroads of several cultures gradually transformed over centuries into something so significant that it warranted a heroic myth of creation. This narrative is both more honest and fascinating than the story of leaves in an emperor's bath. Yet, the latter sells better. The next myth is also about origins, and it highlights that primacy doesn't always belong to those who arrive first. Myth number 6. A city that became a capital later, or the forgotten first cities of America. New York. Just the name evokes the essence of America. 5 boroughs, 8.5 million residents, Wall Street, Broadway, the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, skyscrapers cutting through the fog. A global financial hub, a cultural capital, a symbol of the American dream. Could it have been otherwise? Wasn't New York the leading city of the country from the very beginning? No, it wasn't. When the 13 British colonies declared independence in 1776, New York was under British occupation. It was occupied by the forces of General Howe and remained under British control until November 1783, right until the end of the war. While the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia and the Declaration of Independence was being signed, New York was a city of loyalists and British garrisons. The first capital of the United States under the Constitution was Philadelphia, de facto since that's where Congress convened during the Confederation period. But officially, the first capital according to the Constitution was New York in 1789. This is closer to the truth, although it lasted less than a year and a half. It was here, at Federal Hall on Wall Street, that George Washington took the presidential oath. This is where the first Congress of the nation met. New York was indeed the first capital under the Constitution, but only for a short time. In 1790, the capital moved to Philadelphia, where it remained for 10 years while a new, purpose-built federal city was under construction. This was a compromise between the North and South. Northerners wanted Philadelphia, while Southerners preferred something closer to their states. Legend has it that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson struck a deal over dinner. The South would support Hamilton's financial plan, while the North would agree to the capital by the Potomac River. Thus, Washington, D.C. was born. Since 1800, It has served as the official capital of the United States, a status it holds to this day. Meanwhile, by the early 19th century, New York had surpassed Philadelphia in both population and trade, and it has remained the largest city in the country ever since. But being the largest city and being the capital are two different matters that, in the American case, have never aligned. The very idea of a specifically built capital was a conscious political choice. The Founding Fathers did not want financial and political power to be concentrated in one city. So, New York got the money, while Washington got the power. This separation still causes ongoing tension between the two cities. The narrative that New York has always been the main city is a projection of the present onto the past. It makes psychological sense, but it is historically inaccurate. The next story is about a man who was also considered Maine, but not for the reasons you might expect. Myth number 7, the tyrant in toga, or why Caesar was really killed. "Run, Caesar, the Ides of March are dangerous," warns the soothsayer in Shakespeare's play. March 1544 BC, the Curia of Pompey. 23 dagger thrusts, the most infamous political assassination in history. And the most well-known motive, which gets repeated in textbooks, the conspirators killed Caesar because he wanted to become king. He was supposedly planning to abolish the Republic, crown himself, and establish a monarchy, and the liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, put an end to his life in the name of Republican ideals. This version not only oversimplifies the truth, it completely distorts the political reality of late Republican Rome. Let's start by examining the very concept of king. In ancient Rome, the term rex signified more than just a political title. It was almost a curse, a tainted word that evoked memories of the Tarquin tyrants, exiled 5 centuries earlier. The Republic itself was built on a rejection of kingship. Rex symbolized everything that Rome opposed. Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone. This is why, as recorded by Plutarch and other sources, he publicly and deliberately rejected the royal crown offered to him by Mark Antony during the Lupercalia festival in February of that year. Once, twice, 3 times he refused it. The crowd eventually applauded his dismissal. It was a carefully orchestrated political performance, a display of his unwillingness to embrace royal authority. So, what did he want? He already had it. By the time of his assassination, Caesar was a lifelong dictator, a position he held legally by Senate decree. The dictator wielded more real power than any king, complete command of the military, the right to enact laws, and the authority to appoint magistrates. In effect, Caesar was already a monarch, just without the despised title. So, why kill him now, just days before his military campaign against Parthia? This is where the real story begins. The conspirators, around 60 men from the Senate, were not killing an abstract idea of monarchy. They were murdering a specific individual who had altered the political landscape in Rome in a way that threatened their own power and privileges. Caesar systematically dismantled the system that afforded the senatorial aristocracy its authority. He granted Roman citizenship to provincial residents, thereby eroding the Senate's monopoly on representation. He appointed his allies to key positions without adhering to the traditional cursus honorum, which meant that nobility was no longer the primary criterion for a career. He introduced Gauls and Spaniards into the Senate, thus diluting the exclusivity of the senatorial class. Among the conspirators were many individuals whom Caesar had personally benefited. He pardoned them after the Civil War, appointed them to high offices, showered them with gifts. This was part of his political strategy, and it was this very generosity that irked them the most. They depended on his favor, meaning they were not free citizens of the Republic, but rather clients of a monarch, even if he did not call himself one. Marcus Junius Brutus, the most idealized of the conspirators, that noble Brutus from Shakespeare, was a principled man, but his principles were quite specific. He believed in republican institutions, but by republic, he meant a system in which power belonged to the old aristocracy. Caesar's reforms threatened not the freedom of the people, but the privileges of the elite. The result of the assassination was not the restoration of the republic, but its ultimate demise. 13 years of civil wars, millions dead, and ultimately, Octavian Augustus emerged as the first true monarch of Rome, cleverly masking his authority with republican terminology. The conspirators achieved the exact opposite of what they intended. History is a merciless director. She enjoys such endings. However, the next story is about a different traveler, a different era, and a completely different kind of exploration. Myth number 8. The first European in China, or What Marco Polo Left Unsaid. His book was dubbed A Million Lies. The Venetian merchant who spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan described China with such detail that his contemporaries didn't believe a single word. Porcelain? Paper money? Coal that burns underground? Cities with millions of inhabitants? It sounded like fairy tales. Or lies. Marco Polo returned to Venice and ended up in a Genoese prison, and there, according to legend, dictated his book to fellow inmate and romantic Rustichello. The description of the world, or the Book of Marco Polo, became one of the most widely read works in medieval Europe. For centuries, it established the idea that the first European to reach China was this Venetian trader. But that's not true in at least two key ways. First, Marco Polo was not the first. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo Polo had already been to China. They took young Marco with them on their second voyage. Yet, they were not the first Europeans at the Mongolian court either. As early as Franciscan monk Giovanni da Pian del Carpine traveled to the Mongols on a mission from Pope Innocent IV, aiming to understand the nature of the fearsome conqueror. He reached Mongolia, attended a Kurultai, witnessed the election of a new great Khan, and wrote a detailed report. In 1253, another Franciscan, William of Rubruck, undertook a similar journey, providing even more detailed descriptions. In 1291, Giovanni da Montecorvino went to China as a Catholic missionary, well before Marco Polo's return, and spent the rest of his life there, founding the first Catholic diocese in Beijing. He baptized thousands of Chinese people and corresponded with the Pope. Thus, by the time Marco Polo returned to Europe, there was already a documented tradition of European contacts with the Mongol Empire, including China. Polo was not the first. He was the most eloquent. However, there's a second, much more provocative question. Was he even there at all? This discussion was modernized in 1995 by British historian Frances Wood in her book, Did Marco Polo Go to China? Her arguments are as follows. Marco Polo's description of the world entirely omits mentions of certain things that one cannot miss in China. The Great Wall, tea, Chinese characters, printing, and customs like foot binding among women. For someone who spent 17 years in the country, this silence is peculiar. In Chinese sources from the time of the Mongol Khans, Marco Polo's name is never mentioned, despite the fact that foreigners did get recorded and described at the Khan's court. His supposed position as the governor of the province of Yangzhou is not reflected in any Chinese documents. Supporters of Polo argue that the wall was in ruins during his time and wasn't considered significant, that he might have known tea by another name, and that Chinese sources don't always document foreign officials. The debate remains open. However, the very framing of the question reveals much about the nature of historical memory. Description of the world is a literary work. Rustichello, the novelist who processed Polo's stories, clearly added some artistic embellishments. Today, it's impossible to determine what belongs to the merchant and what to his co-author. Marco Polo remains a great symbol, even if his journey wasn't quite as we imagine it. Symbols matter, but the truth is even more important. Now let's move to the next myth, about those who went nowhere because they were destroyed. At least, that's the common perception. Myth number 9, the vanished empire, or what really happened to the Incas. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and a band of 168 men captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa. They received a ransom worth a room filled with gold and silver for him. Then, they executed him. They took Cusco, the great empire of Tawantinsuyu, stretching from present-day Ecuador to Chile, crumbled before a handful of conquistadors. This became one of the most astonishing military events in human history, and it gave rise to one of the most enduring myths. The Incas were destroyed. Their culture eradicated, their people exterminated, their civilization wiped from the earth by ruthless conquerors. The Incas are alive. There are millions of them. Peruvians, Bolivians, and Ecuadorians who speak Quechua are direct descendants of the Incas and the peoples that made up Tawantinsuyu. Estimates suggest that between 8 and 10 million people speak Quechua today. It is one of the few pre-Columbian languages in the Americas to hold official status. Quechua is an official language in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Spanish conquest did not annihilate the population, it transformed it. The demographic catastrophe of the 16th century was real and horrific. Diseases, particularly smallpox brought by Europeans, decimated between 50 and 90% of the American population in the first 100 years after contact. This is a genuine tragedy and must not be ignored. But it is not the same as the destruction by conquistadors. Viruses made no distinction between Spaniards and Incas. Moreover, the conquest itself was far more complex than a battle between a handful of heroes and a helpless crowd. Pizarro arrived in the empire during a civil war between Atahualpa and his brother Huáscar. Many peoples conquered by the Incas in previous decades saw the Spaniards not as conquerors, but as liberators, and actively aided them. Spanish allies among local populations numbered in the tens of thousands. Spaniards alone could not have conquered anything. The Andean world, a Métis cultural transformation after the conquest. The Andean world didn't become entirely European or completely destroyed. It transformed into a blended synthetic identity. The Incan aristocracy initially maintained its privileged status, while local curacas collaborated with the Spanish administration. The history and mythology of the Incas became actively recorded, particularly by Spanish chroniclers who recognized their value. Cultural conquest was real and profound, imposing Christianity, destroying the quipu, a system of knot-based writing, and demolishing temples to build churches in their place. However, this cultural shift does not equate to the annihilation of a people. Andean traditions, agriculture, cuisine, weaving, and music all continued to thrive, evolving and incorporating new elements. Today, in Peru, a strong movement is underway to reclaim Incan heritage. The Inti Raymi, or Festival of the Sun, is celebrated annually by thousands. Politicians invoke Incan identity, while Quechua is taught in universities. This is not merely a remembrance of a lost people. It's a vibrant culture asserting its place in the modern world. The myth of the destruction of the Incas serves various interests. For the European colonial narrative, it signifies a complete and final conquest. For the anti-colonial narrative, it elevates the victims to martyrdom. Both versions ignore the very descendants of the Incas, who have not vanished, and express their frustrations vividly. The truth is often more complex than convenient narratives. The next myth revolves around yet another war and the belief that it was the last one. Myth number 10, the war to end all wars, or how great hopes perish. The war to end war is a phrase attributed to H.G. Wells, which he used in the title of his 1914 book. It later evolved into the official rhetoric of the Allies and became a cultural slogan. We are fighting for the last time, so there will never be war again. This is what politicians told their people. This belief was genuine, at least for a significant portion of those who held it, making the story of its downfall even more tragic. The very notion that World War I was the last war began to crumble not in September of the 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, but immediately, at Versailles in January 19, when the victors crafted a peace that, ironically, sowed the seeds for the next conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was not a peace agreement, it was a punishment. Germany lost territories, was forced to pay unimaginable reparations, disbanded its army, and signed a clause accepting guilt for the war, a provision perceived as an insult by Germans and lacking solid historical justification. Wilson's 14 points, the plan for a fair peace that Germany referenced in agreeing to the armistice, were essentially discarded by European allies who sought not justice but compensation. Foch, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, looked over the treaty and uttered a prophetic line. "This is not peace. It is a truce for 20 years." He was off by just a few months. World War II began exactly 20 years and 10 months after the signing of the Versailles Treaty. However, the war to end all wars did not result in a lasting peace anywhere. While diplomats gathered in Versailles, dozens of armed conflicts raged across the globe. The Russian Civil War, the Greco-Turkish War, the Polish-Soviet War, the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, and wars in Ireland, Finland, and Hungary. The so-called end of wars turned into a kaleidoscope of conflicts, many of which arose directly from the reordering of the world at Versailles. The very phrase carried a psychological trap. To label any war as the last granted its participants a sort of indulgence for cruelty. If it's the last time, then anything is permissible, anything is justified. This logic allowed governments to demand sacrifices from soldiers and civilians that would never have been accepted had people known this was not the last war, but merely another in a series. The great hopes of 1918, establishing the League of Nations, self-determination for nations, and ending secret diplomacy, collided with the realities of human nature, national interests, and economic contradictions. The League of Nations existed without the United States, which had proposed it in the first place. The Senate refused to ratify it. Self-determination was applied selectively, only where it suited the victors. Secret diplomacy did not vanish. It simply moved from Berlin to Paris and London. The next myth also concerns what the organization was actually about, as its reputation became something entirely disconnected from historical reality. Myth number 11. The Inquisition's fires, or what was really burned in the Middle Ages. Inquisition. The very word conjures images of dungeons, torture devices, bonfires in the town square, and fanatical monks hunting for the slightest deviation from orthodoxy. In the public consciousness, it is synonymous with terror aimed at anything unusual, new, or different, targeting scholars, philosophers, witches, Jews, and heretics of all kinds. The real Inquisition was a fundamentally different institution, not benevolent, but essentially different. First, it's important to note that Inquisition isn't a single organization, but a collective term for several different institutions, divided by centuries and operating principles. The medieval Papal Inquisition of the 13th century, the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th to 16th centuries, as well as the Portuguese and Roman Inquisitions, these were different structures with varying objectives and methodologies. The primary and most crucial misconception is that the medieval Inquisition was not established to pursue witches. Witchcraft in the 13th and 14th centuries was officially regarded as superstition, meaning a misconception held by the common folk. Pope Alexander IV explicitly forbade inquisitors from investigating cases of witchcraft unless they were directly linked to heresy. The great witch hunts were not a phenomenon of the medieval era, but rather of the late modern period, spanning the late 15th to early 18th centuries. Their peak occurred during the Reformation and the religious wars. Most notably, the largest executions took place in Protestant countries, not Catholic ones. Secondly, the Inquisition was not established to combat heretics. Its jurisdiction was strictly limited to baptized Christians. Non-baptized Jews were technically outside its authority. The Spanish Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews and Moors who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly continuing their previous practices. This was a unique situation specific to the Iberian Peninsula due to the Reconquista. Thirdly, and this may be surprising, the Inquisition had a higher standard of proof in some respects than secular courts of the same period. This may sound provocative, but it is backed by documentation. Inquisitorial procedures required 2 witnesses or a confession. A confession obtained under torture had to be confirmed without torture. The accused had the right to know the charges against them, and appeals were possible. By the standards of medieval secular legal proceedings, these were fairly high standards. Torture was employed, that cannot be denied. However, it was strictly regulated. No blood could be shed, no permanent injury was allowed, and the duration of torture was limited. Compared to what was taking place in secular prisons at the same time, this was a mitigation, not an aggravation. As for the notion of thousands burned at the stake, the real numbers starkly contrast with this legend. Over its 3.5-century existence, the Spanish Inquisition sentenced approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people to death, according to modern researchers who have accessed the Vatican's archives. Of these, significantly fewer were actually executed. Many sentences were carried out symbolically, by burning an effigy of the condemned. This doesn't render the Inquisition a blameless institution, but it certainly doesn't support the claim of hundreds of thousands. So, where did the reputation come from? It was propagated by Protestant and Enlightenment narratives. The Black Legend of the Spanish Inquisition was actively crafted by Dutch and English authors, political opponents of Spain, who found it beneficial to portray it as an empire of religious terror. This legend aligned perfectly with the anti-Catholic sentiments of the time and became so widely circulated that it turned into an accepted fact. The next myth involves another institution, shrouded in a far more complex origin story. Number 12. An eternal state, or how the Vatican became independent. The Vatican, a tiny state in the heart of Rome, governed by the Pope, seems as ancient as the Catholic Church itself. Haven't popes always ruled over these hills? Wasn't the Apostle Peter, the first pope, crucified here? Don't the bones of saints lie beneath these marble floors since time immemorial? The Vatican City has been an independent sovereign state since the 1929, which is less than a century. To grasp how unexpected this is, we need to take a quick look back at the history of papal power. For most of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the popes ruled a significant portion of central Italy, known as the Papal States. This area included Rome, Umbria, the Marches, and parts of Emilia-Romagna. It was a genuine secular state with its own army, taxes, and bureaucracy. The pope served as both a spiritual leader and a secular monarch. In 1870, the Italian army, commanded by General Cadorna, entered Rome through Porta Pia and dissolved the Papal States. Rome became the capital of a unified Italy. Pope Pius IX declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, refusing to recognize the Italian state and isolating himself within the walls of the Vatican. His successors maintained this stance for nearly 60 years. The resolution of this conflict came in February 1929, when Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Agreements. Mussolini sought the Church's support to legitimize his fascist regime. In exchange for recognition of the Italian state, the Vatican received sovereignty over a territory of 44 hectares, compensation of 550 million lire for lost territories, and the acknowledgement of Catholicism as Italy's state religion. In return, Pope Pius XI recognized the Italian state and indirectly supported Mussolini's regime. This was a pragmatic deal made by both sides. Vatican City was not born from ancient tradition, but out of the political calculations of 1929. Ironically, the world's smallest sovereign entity exists not only as a mere fragment of land, but also exerts a disproportionately large influence on global politics. This is remarkable in itself, so why cloud this history with myths of ancient continuity? The next myth relates to the artwork we encounter daily in reproductions, yet know far less about than we might believe. Myth number 13, The Last Supper on Plaster, or Why Leonardo Broke All the Rules. In 1495, Leonardo da Vinci took on a commission to decorate the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. He created the Last Supper, one of the most famous images in human history, which many believe to encode hidden meanings, secret codes, and messages for future generations. When people see the Last Supper, they often refer to it as a fresco. Leonardo either painted it on canvas, according to one version, or on wood. Or, perhaps, it is indeed a fresco, but it is none of these. A fresco is a technique of mural painting where pigments are applied to wet plaster. The chemical reaction between lime and pigments creates an exceptionally strong bond, integrating the paint into the wall itself. This is why Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel have survived for 5 centuries in nearly pristine condition. Leonardo, however, did not use the fresco technique. He applied a layer of resin to dry plaster, followed by lead white, and finished with tempera and oil. Why? Because frescoes require quick work while the plaster is wet and allow for no adjustments. Leonardo was an experimental artist, often contemplating a canvas for weeks without touching it, only to make a few strokes and vanish again. He craved the control that fresco painting does not provide. This choice had consequences for the artwork itself. Even during Leonardo's lifetime, the Last Supper began to deteriorate as oil and tempera didn't adhere to dry plaster as well as they would to a fresco. A few decades after its completion, the ambassador from Milan complained that the painting was in terrible condition. By the 17th century, it had deteriorated so much that monks, unfamiliar with preservation methods, cut a door into the lower part of the wall, destroying the feet of Christ and several apostles. Napoleonic soldiers even used the dining hall as a stable, throwing clumps of dirt at the painting. In the 19th century, it underwent several restorations, each time overlaying the original. During World War II, the dining hall was bombed, but the painting survived under bags of sand. By the 20th century, only fragments of Leonardo's original painting remained. The restoration from 78 to 99, led by Penin Brambilla Barcelone, was a monumental project. 21 years of meticulous research, removing later layers, and conserving the original. Restorers worked under microscopes, peeling away layers until they reached the remnants left by Leonardo. What was revealed beneath centuries of alterations? The faces of the apostles, appearing completely different from what we had come to expect in reproductions. The color palette was much softer and cooler than the dark tones generations of viewers had grown accustomed to. The illusion of space in the dining hall, extending into the real space of the monastery's refectory, was only visible in the original. Leonardo's The Last Supper is both one of the greatest works of art and one of the most ravaged by time. Its mystery lies not in encoded messages, but in the fact that the original has all but vanished, and we truly don't know how it looked. Our next story is about a figure whose existence is highly debatable, yet whose legend lives on far more firmly than any fresco. Myth number 14, the noble robber, or who is hiding behind the name of Robin Hood? Sherwood Forest, green attire, a bow, an arrow, flying toward the apple atop an innocent's head. Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. A nobleman from a prestigious family turned outcast due to the unjust actions of the Sheriff of Nottingham. Robin of Locksley, the Earl of Huntingdon, ally of Richard the Lionheart. His image is so vivid and specific that it feels impossible that he never existed. But he didn't exist. More accurately, we can't prove he did. No medieval document confirms the existence of the real Robin Hood. Not a single chronicle, legal record, or tax ledger, despite the diligent record-keeping of medieval bureaucrats, mentions a highwayman by that name operating in Sherwood Forest during the period typically referenced in the legends, the late 12th to early 13th centuries. In medieval England, the name Robin Hood was a common term for vagabonds and petty criminals, akin to John Doe in today's American law. There are references in legal records to Robert Hood or Robin Hood as nicknames for individuals declared outlaws, but these were different people in different places and times with no evident connection. The earliest literary sources about Robin Hood are ballads dating from roughly 1370 to 1450. In the earliest versions, he is neither an earl nor a royal companion, and certainly not a modern-day champion of justice. He is a commoner, possibly a yeoman, a prosperous peasant, living in the woods. His adversaries are not abstract injustice, but rather very concrete ones, abbots charging high interest rates and sheriffs collecting taxes. Class conflict is present, but it is far more grounded than the romanticized versions of later centuries. The image of the noble outlaw who robs from the rich and gives to the poor is a relatively recent development. In the early ballads, Robin Hood is generous to his companions and guests, but he does not function as a systematic redistributor of wealth. He hides in the woods, ambushes merchants and monks, and competes in archery contests. This is literature of dreams, dreams of a life outside the law, freedom from feudal obligations, and fair power against unjust authority. The connection to specific historical figures, Richard I, Prince John, particular dates and places, came later when the creators of the ballads and novels sought to lend historical credibility to the legend. This is the same process that shaped Shen Nong as the discoverer of tea or specified Archimedes' bath, the human need for precise coordinates for myth. The lack of a historical archetype does not diminish Robin Hood's significance. On the contrary, it liberates him. He exists not as a biographical fact, but as a cultural form into which each era pours its own meaning. In the 20th century, he becomes a socialist. In Hollywood adaptations, a superhero. In modern interpretations, a feminist or a corporate rebel. Mythological characters endure far longer than historical ones. The next story is about a phenomenon commonly believed to be a real historical fact, but which might also be a myth created not by romantics, but by state propaganda. Myth number 15, the Empress's Villages, or The Secret of the Potemkin Myth. The year is 1787. Catherine the Great is traveling through the recently annexed Crimea, a territory added to Russia, marking a triumph for her policies. As she journeys along the road, prosperous villages flash by, well-kept homes, contented peasants, and cattle grazing in the fields. The Empress is pleased. New Russia is thriving. Yet at night, according to legend, something strange occurs. Villages are dismantled, loaded onto wagons and boats, and hurriedly transported forward to stand again by the shore the next day, as new settlements. Facades without back walls, painted windows, and hired peasants shuffled from one place to another. This was all orchestrated by Prince Potemkin, Catherine's favorite and de facto co-ruler, to hide the desolation of the conquered lands and impress the visiting Austrian Emperor Joseph II. Potemkin villages has become such a common expression that it is now used colloquially in many languages around the world. Facades that hide real poverty, pretense, deception by those in power. The problem is that this never happened. The fact of the journey was real. The route was real. Potemkin was indeed responsible for organizing the showcase of the newly acquired territories. But the story of the moving villages is propaganda, crafted in real time by diplomatic adversaries of Potemkin and Russia. The main source of this legend comes from the diaries and letters of Saxon diplomat Helbig and Austrian Prince de Ligne, who traveled in the entourage. De Ligne and other foreign observers described what they perceived as artificial and showy in their private letters. However, their accounts were based not on personal observations, but on rumors. None of them actually witnessed villages being assembled and transported. Regarding the actual situation, historians studying documents from that period, Potemkin's correspondence, economic reports, and accounts from local officials found that New Russia was indeed experiencing significant development. From 1774 to 1787, over 100 new settlements were established, cities were built, roads were constructed, and settlers were attracted. This is documented and verified progress. Potemkin did create decorative effects along the route, flags, triumphal arches, and illuminations. This was standard courtly extravagance for a ceremonial visit. But that is fundamentally different from the idea of facade villages without back walls. Where did the legend come from? From political rivalry. Opponents of Potemkin at court, envious of his position and influence, were keen to discredit him. Foreign courts, alarmed by Russia's growing power in the south, aimed to depict Russia's success in Crimea as illusory. The legend satisfied two needs. The irony is that the name of the most capable statesman of the Catherine era has become synonymous with deception, while his true Russia, New Russia, Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, endures to this day. The next story is about another capital that didn't always have that status. Myth number 16, Columbus of Capitals, or The Wanderings of American Power. Washington, D.C., the White House, the Capitol, the Lincoln Memorial. It's hard to imagine American power anywhere else. After all, Washington has always been the capital. How could it be otherwise? The answer to this question was already addressed in the chapter about New York. But the history of American capitals is richer and more complex than just first New York, then Washington. During the War of Independence, the Continental Congress was on the move. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Lancaster, the shortest capital in history lasting just one day, York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York. The Congress relocated for various reasons: threats from British troops, local discontent, political strategy. The concept of capital was quite fluid during this time. After the adoption of the Constitution in New York, from April to December, then Philadelphia, from December to May, finally Washington, from June. The construction of Washington was slow and painful. When President Adams and Congress moved to the new capital in 1018, the city was still a construction site in the middle of swamps. The White House was unfinished. Abigail Adams complained there was no firewood, and she had to dry laundry in the formal halls. The streets were unpaved, and most of the planned buildings had not been constructed. Officials lived in rented rooms with local farmers. Just 14 years later, the British burned Washington during the War of 1812. Congress fled, the White House was destroyed, and some congressmen proposed moving the capital back to Philadelphia or even another location. The proposal narrowly failed, and Washington was rebuilt. The history of American capitals is a story of compromises, practical calculations, and political deals. There's nothing monumentally inevitable about the current location of the capital. It was a choice made by specific people under specific circumstances. The next myth is also about choice, but it concerns who was actually included in everyone. Myth number 17, democracy for all, or who really voted in Athens. 5th century BC Athens, the cradle of democracy. This is known by every schoolchild. Citizens gather in the agora. Everyone can speak their mind. Every vote GDK counts. For the first time in history, the people are governing themselves, and this principle laid the foundation for modern democracies 25 centuries later. This is true, and at the same time, it conceals something fundamental. The term every citizen in Athenian democracy referred GDK. To participate in voting, one had to be a man, born free, and the son of an Athenian citizen from both sides. These were 3 strict requirements, automatically excluding a vast portion of the population. Women, who made up about half of the free population, were completely excluded from political life. There were no exceptions, no qualifications. Slaves accounted for an estimated 20 to 35% of the population of Attica. In fact, at the peak of classical Athens, the number of slaves was roughly equal to that of free individuals. Slaves not only lacked political rights, they were considered property. Metics, free individuals of non-Greek origin living in Athens, constituted a significant part of the urban population. They included merchants, craftsmen, philosophers, even Aristotle was a metic, and artists. They paid taxes, served in the military, and contributed to the city's wealth. However, they held no political rights. Consequently, of the roughly 300,000 residents of Attica, the actual participants in Athenian democracy, as estimated by historians, numbered between 30 and 40,000, meaning only 10 to 15% of the population. Does this diminish the significance of Athenian democracy? Not at all. The very principle that governance is not in the hands of a single person or a narrow hereditary elite, but rather a collective of citizens making decisions through discussion and voting, was revolutionary. This principle has indeed laid the foundation for Western political tradition. However, there's a problem. When we idealize Athenian democracy as the power of the people, we inadvertently adopt its limitations as well. The logic of not everyone is worthy of participating in governance has lived on in Western political thought for a long time, rooted in the Athenian precedent. Those in the 19th century who opposed women's suffrage or the repeal of property qualifications cited classic examples as justification. Athenian democracy was a great beginning, but it is not quite what it is often perceived to be. Now, here's a different story, about a grand project that collapsed for reasons you might not expect. Myth number 18, yellow fever at the Panama Canal, or the truth behind the French failure. Panama, the late 19th century. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the triumph of Suez, the great Frenchman, the man who carved a canal through Africa, embarked on a new monumental project to connect two oceans via the Panama Isthmus. The idea was brilliant, the scale unprecedented, and the project failed. Almost 90,000 workers died. Shareholders' money vanished. De Lesseps and his son were convicted of fraud. This became one of the largest financial scandals in the history of the Third French Republic. So why did the French fail? The official answer, which you will find in most textbooks, is yellow fever and malaria. Tropical diseases killed workers faster than they could be hired. Without the modern understanding of disease carriers, like mosquitoes, combating the epidemics was impossible. This was a medical failure. However, the reality is far more complicated and less flattering for the French leadership. Yes, the diseases were terrifying. Yes, the death toll on the construction site was horrendous. But the medical factor was not the cause of failure. It was merely a contributing circumstance. The real issues were engineering, financial, and managerial, subjects that are often discussed less frequently. De Lesseps insisted on building the canal at sea level, no locks like the Suez. This was an engineering mistake, pointed out to him from the very beginning. The terrain of Panama was incomparably more complex than the Egyptian desert. The Continental Divide mountain range, unpredictable rivers, and an enormous volume of rock to be excavated. Later, the Americans built the canal with locks, just as the French engineers had suggested to de Lesseps. To this day, the Panama Canal operates this way. The financial model of the project was disastrous. De Lesseps intentionally underestimated the public cost projections to attract investors. The actual expenses far exceeded forecasts, and he knew it. When the initial stock offerings didn't generate enough funds, the company issued new stocks to pay off debts, borrowing more money in the process. This was a classic scheme that could only survive if the project was completed on time, but it was consistently delayed. Corruption was systemic. A significant portion of the funds went to bribes to French parliamentarians and journalists who were supposed to protect the company's reputation and hinder investigations. When the scandal eventually broke, it became one of the largest in the history of French politics, with hundreds of officials, deputies, and senators implicated in receiving money from the Panama Company. Yellow fever was a real catastrophe for those dying in tropical shanties, but for the financial collapse of the company, it was merely a convenient explanation that helped to conceal the incompetence of the leadership and the scale of the corruption. The next myth is about a military victory, the explanation of which has also become a legend. Myth number 19, the Archers of Agincourt, or why the victory was found where it was not expected. Shakespeare's Henry V, the speech before battle. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Agincourt, October 25, 1415. 6,000 exhausted, sick, drenched English soldiers against 25 to 30,000 of the French chivalry. And an astonishing victory. How was this possible? The answer given in textbooks, movies, and popular literature: English longbows. Welsh and English archers, able to shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute, literally rained down a hail of iron upon the French knights. The arrows pierced their visors, found gaps in armor, and killed horses. The French forces were largely defeated before they even reached the English positions. This is partially true, but this partial truth conceals something significant. The longbow was indeed a formidable weapon, and English archers inflicted devastating damage on the French cavalry. However, the effectiveness of the bow can be attributed not just to the skill of the archers, but also to the tactical circumstances. The French knights attacked across a narrow field flanked by forests. The heavy cavalry lost its maneuverability. The ground was wet and slippery from the rain, horses stumbled, and knights in heavy armor fell and struggled to get back up. English archers stood behind rows of sharpened stakes driven into the ground, a simple yet effective barrier against cavalry. However, the decisive factor in the victory at Agincourt is often overlooked in popular narratives. After the initial French assault, which had already caused significant losses, Henry faced an unexpected problem: thousands of prisoners taken during the battle. These captives were cramped, disoriented, but not disarmed. Suddenly, a group of French peasants appeared behind the English lines, attacking the supply wagons. Fearing that the prisoners would strike at the guards while all forces were occupied with this new threat, Henry ordered many of the captives to be killed. This was a mass execution of those who had already laid down their arms, a flagrant violation of the chivalric codes of the time. Chroniclers wrote about this with horror, and Shakespeare hints at it, avoiding outright condemnation of his hero. The victory at Agincourt was real and impressive. Yet, it was achieved through a combination of sound tactics, favorable terrain, weather conditions, and actions that were deemed dishonorable by contemporaries. The legend of a pure triumph of skill over numbers is a myth created by later propaganda. The next myth takes us across the Atlantic to the people whose dwellings have become symbols of an entire way of life. Myth number 20. All Indians lived in teepees, or how Hollywood created America. A conical tent made of skins, adorned with geometric patterns, feathers and hair, horses, tomahawks. This image, the deeply ingrained stereotype of the Indian, actually represents a very specific group of tribes, the peoples of the Great Plains, who emerged as a cultural phenomenon in the 18th and 19th centuries. Teepees are remarkable structures, perfectly suited for the nomadic life of buffalo hunters. They can be quickly assembled and disassembled, retain warmth in winter, ventilate in summer, and withstand the prairie winds. However, teepees were the homes of only some of the Plains peoples, specifically the Lakota, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet, and only them. Prior to European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America encompassed hundreds of different cultural groups, each with their own languages, economies, and architectural traditions. The Iroquois built longhouses made of wood and bark, which accommodated multiple families at once. The Navajo lived in hogans, round earth homes. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest built massive wooden houses adorned with carved pillars. The Pueblo constructed multi-story stone fortresses that amazed Spanish conquistadors with their resemblance to cities back in Europe. The Seminoles of Florida lived in open platform houses designed for the humid climate. Inuits made their homes in igloos made of snow and semi-subterranean dwellings. The term Indians itself is the result of Columbus's geographical error, lumping hundreds of diverse nations under one name that shares no more similarity than Europeans have among themselves. It's akin to calling all the residents of Eurasia Eurasians and depicting them all in Russian ushankas. How did the teepee become the universal Indian dwelling? Thanks to Hollywood westerns. The nations of the Great Plains, particularly the Lakota Sioux, emerged as the main protagonists in the Indian Wars during the last third of the 19th century. Their clashes with the U.S. Army occurred in front of countless witnesses, receiving extensive media coverage and being captured on camera. The Wild West became a defining American myth, and the people who inhabited it became a visual symbol representing the term Indian. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, touring the U.S. and Europe since 1973, featured Lakota warriors in teepees as the main attraction. Millions of spectators around the world were introduced to this image, and it became iconic. The diversity of real North America is one of the greatest sacrifices made at the altar of narrative. Now, let's address another myth regarding a date often considered perfectly accurate, which is anything but. Myth number 21. May 8th, or when the war really ended. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. London, New York, Paris explode with celebration. The war in Europe is over. This statement is as accurate as saying, winter ended on March 1st. The official surrender of Germany was signed twice. Once on the night of May 7-8 in Reims, a preliminary act signed with the Western Allies, and again on May 9 in Berlin, a formal ceremony for the Soviet side, which insisted on a legally binding act in the presence of representatives from all Allied nations. This is why the USSR and most Eastern European countries celebrate Victory Day on May 9th, while Western countries commemorate it on May 8. However, even this date did not mark the end of hostilities. At the time of the surrender, German troops were still fighting in several areas, not just due to a lack of information. Some German units surrendered to Western allies, refusing to capitulate to Soviet forces. On the island of Bornholm, the German garrison surrendered to the Soviets on May 9th, only after a Soviet bombing. German troops on the Atlantic Wall, in isolated fortresses along the French coast, continued to surrender for several days after the official capitulation. The Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Schörner, continued its combat operations in Czechoslovakia for several days after May 8th. It was against this group that the final significant offensive operation of the Soviet forces in Europe was directed, the Prague Offensive, which concluded on May 11th. The situation at sea was even more complicated. German submarines in the Atlantic received radio signals about the surrender, but each commander had to make the choice: surface and surrender, or dive to avoid capture. Several submarines spent weeks after May 8th making their way toward the shores of Argentina, where their captains hoped to find refuge. In an extreme example, Japanese troops on some Pacific islands continued to fight for years, either because they hadn't received news of the surrender or simply didn't believe it. One such soldier, Hiro Onoda in the Philippines, surrendered only in 20 years, 29 years after the war had ended. War doesn't end with the signing of a document. It's a gradual winding down that can take weeks and sometimes even decades. Next, we confront a myth about an event that's often thought to be well documented. However, it might have unfolded quite differently. Myth number 22, the Reformer's Mallet, or how Luther did not nail his theses. On October 31, 1517, Martin Luther approached the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, took out a hammer, and ceremoniously nailed a sheet of paper with 95 theses against indulgences to the wood. The sound of the hammer echoed across Europe. The Reformation had begun. This image has become an icon of Protestantism, a solitary monk challenging the immense power of the Roman Church with a symbolic gesture. The hammer and nail as tools of revolution. However, it's highly likely that Luther did not actually nail the theses to the church door. At least not in the dramatic form that has entered legend. The main issue with this narrative is that it first appears in sources significantly later than the events themselves. The only source claiming that Luther nailed the theses is a biography written by his friend and colleague, Philip Melanchthon, several years after Luther's death. Notably, Melanchthon was not in Wittenberg on October 31, 1517. In fact, Luther himself never described this event in any of his numerous letters or writings as a public ceremonial act. His own contemporary accounts of the situation are much more mundane. He sent the theses to several bishops and theologians, inviting academic discussion. It was a standard university practice to post theses for debate. The church door at the university in Wittenberg was indeed used as a bulletin board. It's possible that a clerk, or even Luther himself, did attach the theses to the door as an announcement for an upcoming discussion. However, the idea of nailing them ceremoniously with a hammer is a reconstruction by later hagiographers. What happened next is far more interesting than the hammer. Luther's theses were originally written in Latin for an academic audience. They were translated into German and disseminated throughout Germany within a few weeks, thanks to Gutenberg's revolutionary invention, the printing press. This was the first viral publication in history, if we were to use modern terms. The theses found their audience not because Luther nailed them to a door with a hammer, but because the technology of information dissemination had transformed radically. The Reformation was made possible not by the hammer, but by the printing press. Next up, we have a myth about another organization, one that is often thought to have a much older and nobler origin. Myth number 23, the Samurai Brotherhood, or what Yakuza really are.
Yakuza, tattooed warriors of Japan's shadowy underworld, a code of honor. The act of slicing off a finger as atonement. Loyalty to the clan.
In popular belief and significantly within Japanese societal discourse, the Yakuza are positioned as a continuation of the samurai tradition, an organization with roots in feudal Japan that operates under a code reminiscent of Bushido. The true origins of the Yakuza are far less romantic. The term Yakuza comes from a combination of cards in the Japanese game Oicho Kabu, 8, 9, 3. In Japanese, ya means 8, ku means 9, and za means 3. This combination represents the worst possible hand in the game, worth 0 points. Yakuza literally means a loser, a worthless person. The organization named itself the outcasts of society, whether in bitter irony or as a challenge. The actual historical roots of the Yakuza trace back to two groups from the Edo period, 17th to 19th centuries. Tekiya, itinerant merchants who sold goods at fairs and markets and often engaged in fraud, and bakuto, professional gamblers. Neither group had any ties to the samurai class. They hailed from the lowest ranks of the social hierarchy in Tokugawa Japan, classes not even included in the official four-tier system. The samurai aesthetic was deliberately adopted later on as a tool for self-legitimization. Principles of loyalty, hierarchy, and codes of conduct were borrowed from samurai culture and imposed on criminal organizations trying to present themselves as something more than mere gangs of racketeers. It's marketing, not history. Modern Yakuza, as an organized structure, largely materialized in the post-war period, especially amidst the chaos of the black market and destruction following 1945. It thrived precisely when traditional state structures were weakened and the country's economy required informal mechanisms. No continuous tradition from feudal times exists. Interestingly, the Yakuza organizations themselves actively cultivate and maintain their samurai image. It's beneficial for recruitment, discipline, and negotiations with official authorities. Japanese society has long tolerated the existence of the Yakuza because it embraced a narrative of organized crime as a guardian of traditional values. The next myth is about a speech that broke down the wall, literally and figuratively. Myth number 24. Tear down this wall, or who really broke the USSR? June 12, 1987. President Reagan stands at the Brandenburg Gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he declares. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War comes to an end. In American popular thought, and in a significant part of political rhetoric, this cause and effect relationship is seen as obvious. Reagan defeated the USSR through his personality, his speech, and his policies. The reality was far more complex and considerably less flattering to the idea that one person or one nation single-handedly dismantled the Soviet system. Let's start with the speech itself. It had no immediate impact. The Soviet press largely ignored it. No instant political changes followed. The West German media mentioned it in passing. The speech was recorded and soon forgotten, at least for the moment. The Berlin Wall did not fall because of Reagan's speech. It came down on November 9, 1989, due to a series of absurd bureaucratic events. The new leader of East Germany held a press conference. When asked about new travel regulations, he read a document provided to him without fully grasping its content and declared that East German citizens could cross the border freely. When? Immediately, without delay. Crowds gathered at the border crossings. The guards had not received any instructions. The senior officer made a unilateral decision to open the gates. That's it. The wall fell. This was not a planned operation. It was a mistake, compounded by bureaucratic chaos. As for the dissolution of the USSR, it was a process rooted in structural contradictions within the Soviet system that had been building for decades. An economy unable to compete with the West in technological development, national movements in the Union republics. The Afghan War, which became for the USSR what Vietnam was for the US. The oil shock of the 1980s, which collapsed the primary source of Soviet income. growing corruption, and a loss of ideological legitimacy, Reagan's policies, the arms race, support for anti-Soviet movements, and the Strategic Defense Initiative did create additional pressure. However, assigning her the main role ignores the internal contradictions that Soviet citizens and their leaders felt on a daily basis. Gorbachev, who decided not to use military force to suppress popular movements in Eastern Europe, did more for the peaceful end of the Cold War than any American speech ever could. This decision not to send troops into Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or East Germany contradicted the very logic of the Soviet system, and it cost him his power. History rarely unfolds due to a single speech. However, one impactful speech at the right moment can serve as a powerful epilogue to a complex process. Next, let's address the myth surrounding a scientific discovery often credited to just one individual. Myth number 25, waves in space-time, or who really predicted gravitational waves? In September of 25, LIGO detectors picked up the first credible signal of gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time caused by the merger of two black holes. This was one of the greatest discoveries in the history of physics, sparking the immediate response, Einstein was right, because it was indeed Einstein who predicted the existence of gravitational waves in 10,000 Samsa Definith as part of his general theory of relativity. While this is true, it is also an incomplete narrative. First, Einstein himself harbored doubts about the reality of gravitational waves. In a 1936, he co-authored a paper with Nathan Rosen arguing that gravitational waves did not exist. They were merely a mathematical artifact, not a physical reality. The journal Physical Review rejected their paper with critical reviewer comments. Einstein was outraged. The editorial team later published a revised version with an opposing conclusion after he reviewed the reviewers' arguments. Thus, Einstein first predicted gravitational waves, then recanted, and later returned to the idea. This is how science typically works, but it doesn't fit the linear narrative of a genius predicted it and we confirmed it, which is commonly promoted. Second, a huge contribution to the existence of LIGO, the detector that discovered gravitational waves, came from individuals whose names are largely unknown to the public. Rainer Weiss, Kip Thorne, and Barry Barish were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2069, rightfully so. However, LIGO was built and launched thanks to the efforts of thousands of scientists and engineers over a span of 40 years. The very technology of laser interferometry that allowed for the detection of vibrations smaller than a proton is the result of decades of engineering work, unrelated to Einstein's name. Thirdly, Henri Poincaré had introduced a concept very similar to gravitational waves back in 1905, 1 year before Einstein's special theory of relativity and 11 years before his work on gravitational waves. The history of science is far more collaborative than the narrative of lone geniuses suggests. The next story is about a tragedy whose official recognition took nearly a century. Myth number 26, a recognized genocide, or how the world looked away. The genocide of the Armenians has been recognized by the international community. This statement can be heard in various contexts, as if it were a given, as if international recognition occurred long ago, unanimously, and is now a settled matter. In reality, this is one of the most painful and unresolved issues in international historical politics. The Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923 claimed, by various estimates, between 600,000 and 1.5 million lives. This systematic extermination of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire, through deportations to the Syrian desert, mass shootings, and forced death marches, is extensively documented with diplomatic reports, accounts from American and German, Turkey's allies, and neutral sources, photographs, and testimonies from survivors. Turkey officially denies the genocide, referring to the events of 1915 as tragic events, or mutual losses in wartime. This has been the state's official position since the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. When did the major powers officially recognize the genocide? The United States only acknowledged it in April 2021 under President Biden. Before this, American presidents avoided using the term due to strategic partnerships with Turkey, a NATO member. Biden's predecessors from both parties, including those who promised recognition during their campaigns, consistently backtracked after taking office. Germany recognized the genocide in 2016, exactly 100 years after events in which its own diplomats and military were witnesses and sometimes even participants. This recognition was not without controversy. The resolution sparked intense debate, and Turkey recalled its ambassador in response. To date, around 30 countries have recognized the genocide, which is a significant portion of the global community, but far from all. Neither the UN as a whole nor most countries in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East have officially recognized it.
This remains a living, unresolved issue, not a historically settled fact. Historians refer to this as the geopolitics of memory.
The recognition or denial of historical crimes is determined not only by historical evidence, but also by current alliances, economic interests, and strategic calculations. The next myth involves another 20th century event that is similarly misrepresented. Myth number 27, without warning, Ormber 27, without warning, or what Japan knew before Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. Enola Gay. The first atomic bomb used in combat in history. 140,000 people would be dead by the end of the year. It was a sudden strike, and Japan had no warning. This is not entirely accurate. Days before the bombing of Hiroshima, American planes dropped pamphlets over Japanese cities warning of impending destruction. These pamphlets were vague. They did not mention the new weapon or specify particular cities. Specific targets were kept secret for military reasons. But they urged Japanese citizens to evacuate from military-industrial cities. About 35 Japanese cities received warnings about impending aerial attacks days before they occurred. This was standard practice during American strategic bombings. Specifically, leading up to the bombing of Hiroshima on July 13, 1917, President Truman was informed that the Trinity test had been successful. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, which was an ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender under the threat of Japan and utter destruction. The declaration did not explicitly mention the atomic bomb, for several reasons, including the fact that the U.S. was still unsure about its combat readiness. The Japanese government rejected the ultimatum. This decision seemed to stem from sharp divisions within the Japanese government and military. Part of the leadership understood that the war was lost, while another faction believed it was still possible to continue. As for the decision to drop the bombs, the debate over its moral justification continues to this day. Had all alternatives been explored? Was a demonstration over uninhabited land possible? Did the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan hasten its surrender? These questions remain unanswered, but the fact remains, the bombing of Hiroshima was not without warning in the absolute sense often depicted. There was no specific warning about the specific weapon used in a specific city. That's a different level of context. The next story is about people who lived outside the law, yet created surprisingly intricate legal systems. Myth number 28, democracy on a pirate ship, or the truth and romance of high seas robbery. Pirates of the Caribbean, the Jolly Roger Flying High, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Bartholomew Roberts. In popular culture, especially after historian Marcus Rediker described pirates as a kind of maritime anarchists in his book Villains of All Nations, a picture has emerged of the pirate ship as a utopia of equality, democratic elections for captain, fair distribution of loot, social G-gay insurance for the injured, a vote for everyone. This is not a myth. It's a half-truth with significant omissions. Pirate articles, codes of conduct on board, did indeed exist, and were remarkably democratic by the standards of their time. Many have been preserved in the legal records of those who were captured and tried. The captain was elected by the crew and could be removed by them as well. The share of the loot was distributed according to pre-agreed rules. Compensation was provided for injuries, a sort of insurance. These are real facts. However, there was another aspect that the romanticized version overlooks. The democracy on a pirate ship applied only to those who were on board voluntarily. A significant portion of crews were taken captive from seized ships and recruited under duress. These individuals formally signed the articles, but their agreement was forced. Historians debate the actual share of volunteers versus conscripts on various ships. Captured prisoners who refused to join were often tortured or killed. This was systematic. If there was democracy on board, it was reserved for the select few. For everyone else, it was sheer terror. Moreover, the very concept of democracy had strict limits. The quartermaster, the second in command on the ship, held significant power that could challenge the captain's authority. However, once battle commenced, the captain wielded absolute control. Articles of agreement meticulously outlined discipline and punishments. There was no place for anarchy. Pirates of the Golden Age, roughly from the 1715 to 1730, operated in a unique historical context. Many were former privateers or naval sailors left unemployed after the wars over the Spanish succession. Their democratic practices were partly a response to the brutality of the official navy, where captains had total authority, salaries were often delayed, and punishments were harsh. The romanticization of piracy is understandable, and to some extent justified, but it should not overshadow the fact that pirates were, first and foremost, criminals who killed and plundered. Next, we explore the myth of the man who discovered a new world, unaware of it. Myth number 29, the stubborn explorer, or what Columbus really thought.
That Columbus was convinced until his dying day that he discovered India.
This statement sounds like a condescending anecdote about one man's stubbornness. The great navigator, unable to accept the obvious. An obstinate old man who continued insisting it was India while the whole world already knew the truth. The reality is much more complex. First, Columbus did indeed insist until his death that he had reached Asia. But this was not simply madness. It was a deliberate stance based on his theoretical calculations and theological beliefs. He believed he had arrived at the eastern islands of Asia, the Spice Islands, part of a vast Asian archipelago. This interpretation accounted for much of what he encountered. Second, the very idea of a new world didn't emerge right away. The first person to articulate in writing that the lands to the west were not Asia but a separate continent was Amerigo Vespucci in his letters of the early 16th century. His name ultimately gave the continent its name. But this realization came only after numerous expeditions. Third, and most importantly, Columbus was aware of actual distances. He understood that Greek geographers had approximately calculated the Earth's circumference correctly. To align his calculations, he deliberately underestimated the distance to Asia, using Arabic miles instead of Italian where it suited him. He aimed to reach Asia within a reasonable distance. When his ships landed exactly where he expected to find the Asian islands, it was seen as confirmation of his calculations, not a refutation. The most tragic aspect of this story is that Columbus seemingly died disappointed and in disgrace, having not received the privileges he was promised by the Spanish crown. Its discovery was quickly reinterpreted by others, its routes were improved, and its management of overseas territories was deemed catastrophic, and rightly so. A man who changed the world went unrecognized in his lifetime, even by those who benefited the most. History is a harsh accountant. It credits achievements to winners, not the pioneers. The final myth revolves around a disease often thought to be a thing of the past. Myth 30, the end of the plague, or a disease that never left. The Black Death, 1347 to 1353. A third of Europe. Corpses in the streets. Gravediggers unable to keep up. A vision of hell unleashed upon the world. Then came a slow tapering off, subsequent waves becoming smaller and smaller, until, by the 18th and 19th centuries, the disease seemingly disappeared from Europe. The plague vanished? The plague never went away. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the plague, exists in rodent populations worldwide, in the American plains, Central Asia, Africa, and China. It hasn't gone anywhere. It simply stopped killing humans on such a massive scale. Why? historians and epidemiologists still don't fully understand. The plague continued to claim lives even after the 14th century, just on a smaller scale. Epidemics in London during the 17th century took thousands of lives. The Great Plague in Marseille from 1722 killed about 50,000 people, half the city's population. The Third Plague pandemic, which began in China in 1722, spread globally, killing over 12 million people, mostly in India. This was the 20th century, not the Middle Ages. According to the World Health Organization, there are between 1,000 to 2,000 plague cases reported each year worldwide. The most frequent hotspots include Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Peru, and Bolivia. A 2017 outbreak in Madagascar was declared a public health emergency by the WHO, with over 2,000 cases and more than 200 deaths. Cases of plague are also reported in the United States, averaging a few cases each year, mainly in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. The source is squirrels, prairie dogs, and other wild rodents. The last fatality in the U.S. occurred relatively recently. Why did the plague stop killing millions in Europe? There's no definitive answer. Some theories suggest improved sanitation, changes in the balance of black and brown rats, the latter being less likely to coexist with humans, and possibly the evolution of immunity among populations that experienced multiple outbreaks. Antibiotics discovered in the 20th century can effectively treat the plague if diagnosed in time, but the bacterium never truly disappeared. The image of the plague as a medieval disease is deeply ingrained and profoundly misleading. It creates a false sense of security. The history of disease knows no final victors, only temporary ceasefires. And now we have reached the last page of this archive. 30 myths. 30 times history has proven to be more complex, interesting, and honest than what we have come to believe. What connects all these stories? Myths arise from needs: the need for a hero, a simple explanation, a beautiful symbol, a convenient enemy, a legitimizing narrative. These needs are entirely human and understandable. The problem arises when we can no longer tell myth from fact and start making decisions based on captivating tales instead of real events. History is not a collection of ready-made answers. It is a living conversation that each generation must engage in anew. This conversation demands a willingness to hear the uncomfortable, to embrace the complex, and to let go of what was once common knowledge. Archives continue to hold their secrets. Researchers keep asking difficult questions, and myths persist because we continue to nourish them. The question is not whether new myths will emerge. They undoubtedly will. The real question is how quickly we will learn to recognize them. Until the next archival discovery.